Singularity.
My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this show, you can help me make it better in two ways. One, you can go to iTunes and write a brief review for my show, or two, you can actually become a patron via the recently launched Patreon campaign by going to patreon.com/SingularityFM. Today, my guest on the show is the legendary head of the legendary MIT Media Lab. So, Joi Ito, welcome to Singularity FM.
Hi, thank you for having me today.
Fantastic, Joi. I've been, working on this interview for a while now. So I read your book, Whiplash, or I should say I listened to it as an audiobook and I browsed through it. I read your thesis draft that you sent me, and I probably watched 15 hours of videos and interviews with you as a preparation for this. So I've been looking for this so much. But for some of our audience who may not be familiar with who you are and what you do, can you please introduce yourself in a couple of words?
It's hard in a couple of words, but I'm currently at MIT at the Media Lab, but this is in the last 7 years. And before that, I was very involved in the development of the internet, running an ISP, running Creative Commons. And most of my background actually is in internet entrepreneurship and venture investing.
So if I force you to pick a single word, would that be an entrepreneur that describes you best, or what?
I think it's an entrepreneurial activist. Or Timothy Leary used to use the term performing philosopher. I think other people have described the category of what I do as public intellectual work. So some variation of that, but it's the application of ideas to try to change things.
I love Timothy Leary too, but I do like your version better for yourself. I mean, what did you say? Entrepreneurial activist.
Activist, yeah.
I think that's really unique and memorable. And I think that fits you very well.
I just made that up. I'm going to start using it.
Well, that's the whole point of conversations like this, right? This is what Socrates was all about, to create a symposium where each of us discovers something new, something fresh, right? So I'm very happy if this interview helped me be a midwife to you discovering that you are the entrepreneurial activist that you are. That's a great start, by the way. So let's throw another fun question there. Dog person or a cat person?
Dog.
Dog. Why dog?
Well, let's see. Well, mostly I've had dogs, but I think dogs are more social. And I think that my primary medium of expression and intervention is in communities rather than by myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as Ryan Holiday says, cats are just animals that live in your house.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they're always kind of like giving the impression that, they don't really need you for anything. They just like give you the grace of hanging out in your place, but they can take off anytime they feel like it. Whereas dogs...
They train you.
Absolutely. Dogs train you. Exactly right. What kind of dog did you have, by the way?
So we have two Japanese mutts. We used to live in the countryside in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And they're kind of like the local security system, because you can hear when there's a stranger in the village by whose dog is barking. And so they just give you these dogs as part of the ecosystem of the village. And we brought them to Boston with us when we moved.
So are they barking now all day long?
A lot, yeah.
Okay, so tell me how someone who gets kicked out of kindergarten then becomes a DJ in the south side of Chicago nightclub, and then eventually drops out of college 2, maybe even 3 times, ends up becoming a head of a major part of one of the most sort of impressive educational institutions from around the world. How is that even possible? You don't even have an undergraduate degree, as far as I
No,
know.
no, I don't. It's a long story. I think I never thought I would be in an academic institution, and the Media Lab was going through a fairly extensive search trying to find a new director. And originally, I knew Nicholas Negroponte, the founder, and I knew some people who were on the search committee. But when I sent Nicholas my CV and he realized I hadn't graduated from college, he first said, "Oh, this isn't going to work. So don't, you know, we won't formally put you in." But then after, I guess, several hundred uh, going through all the applicants, they ran out without finding anybody. And so they decided to change the criteria and had me come back in. And I met them for a few days, the students and the faculty and staff, and we just hit it off. And it just became, and this is what's sort of wonderful about MIT. I think it's a quite a pragmatic school. So once the lab decided that it made sense, the provost and the president, the dean were, I guess the president was involved, but the provost basically welcomed me in very warmly, and and it's never been an issue once I've gotten there. And I think the key thing is the Media Lab is not a traditional research lab, and it's I think we're now doing so many things that the only way you can actually support the lab is you almost have to be interested in everything, which is kind of the opposite of what academics are supposed to do. So finding somebody with an academic career that could be interested in everything was actually quite a challenge. So they had to reach out of their traditional pool.
This is one of the reasons, by the way, why I never did a PhD, is because I was like interested in everything. But I can't remember whose quote it was, but somebody said that a person who follows their own curiosity is always interested in everything. Whereas the people who are interested in only one thing are kind of just like following orders, almost like.
Yeah. Yeah, I think as you mentioned, I'm now working on a PhD, but it's very hard because the PhD is a PhD about how you can be interested in everything. And so, but you can kind of try to get there. You're a philosopher, and I think there's a interesting history of science and a philosophy around how uh, knowledge and disciplines get created and how they're centered around communities. And so as somebody who enjoys thinking about communities, I've been trying to figure out, and this I won't complete in the PhD, but it will begin this exploration. What is the architecture and the values of a community that has a way to think about things very broadly but still rigorously? That's, I think, our challenge at the Media Lab.
We're going to talk about your thesis a bit later on, and I have a
Okay.
handy copy of it right here next to me. But let me ask you before that, why did you feel, or did you feel compelled in any way because of that lack of previous degree to do? Why do a PhD now?
Yeah, I was working on, and I also dropped out of several PhD. I dropped out of a DBA.
And how can you even do one if you didn't even do an undergrad? Like, how is that even possible?
But I think in Europe and in the US, they have not. I'm sorry, not in the US, but in Europe and in Japan, they have a peculiar category of PhD called a thesis PhD, where you present a thesis, basically the dissertation draft. They admit you, and then you do the defense first, and then the dissertation is really about the work you've done in your life and how that represents and proves your contribution based on your thesis. So it's different from a traditional one. And I got to the point where I'd been thinking about the Media Lab and its context within academia for the last, 7 years. And I realized that what I was doing was trying to put together all of these things. And the PhD format isn't the best, but it's a decent format. And two things. I think my students, many of them are PhD students. And so going through the process and sort of getting an understanding of what they're going through. And I thought theoretically that was true, but as I did the dissertation, I realized it was factually correct, that it was something that you really don't understand unless you try to do it. And then I think the other thing is my advisor that I had been working with at Keio University, Jun Murai, who's the father of the Japanese internet. He's going to retire eventually, and so he said you should do this before I retire. So that those are the two things.
Wow. Yeah, because it's funny how you have PhD students that you teach, and yet you don't even have an undergraduate degree. That's phenomenal. But let me ask you this. Who was the person who had the biggest impact on your life?
I was very. I think the thing that. So I'm very lucky. I think most people who are successful are lucky. I don't think you could be successful without a lot of luck. And if I had to pick the thing that I was lucky about, is I had the luck of meeting some very important to me mentors along the way at kind of appropriate moments. And so I think the first person who really influenced me was my father's professor, Dr. Fukui, who was he won a Nobel Prize in chemistry. But he in Japan, you're very narrow. So if you're a chemist, you're only supposed to talk about chemistry. But he had, in the 60s, was talking about hydrogen economy and solar, and he had views on poverty, and so as a 13-year-old, he would sit with me for hours talking to me about chaos and about actually he was the one that suggested that you can't upload the brain to a computer when I was 13. So in the early 80s, I was so excited about computers. I still remember this, and I had learned about computers, and I had a 2-hour dinner with him, and I said I am going to upload my brain to a computer. And he said he didn't say absolutely no, but he said, go study chaos theory and come back and let's talk. And this is at 13, so you're a very small kid. So I then started reading, and basically the point was the world is quite complex and it's not as easy as you think. And then later, when I was in high school, I got excited about the internet and was explaining the internet to him, and he said, beware of fluctuation amplification, which turns out I think is one of the bigger problems. So those ideas really helped. And still, as you can see, I'm still thinking about them. And then I think the other person is Timothy Leary, who I met when I was 20, just turning 24. And he was kind of knocked me off of this path I was on that was a little bit sort of going into the spiritual path, looking for a guru. And he sort of very quickly said, this is all, most of it's a joke. Most of it's not true. There is no guru. Think for yourself. His whole thing was think for yourself and question authority. And so that got me into a different mode in my early 20s. And then there have been others, Stanislav Shinsky, who was a college dropout or a high school dropout, who created the field of amorphous materials, and many other people. So that's why I was able to, without any education, stumble around and learn. Was I was able to go find people who were, in your words, through a Socratic method, engage. And I think what I still do this as well, is I think some of the most interesting people love talking to children because it challenges them to explain things in understandable ways. And kids often give you or ask you questions or give you insights that people in your field might not. So I think this relationship between mentors and students is a really important piece, and that I think a good university experience will give it to you, but you don't necessarily need to go to university for that.
Yeah, I agree. I couldn't agree more with you. And there's three things that I just want to very briefly touch on here based on what you said. The first thing is that you said you've been very lucky to have tremendous mentors at different points in your life. And that reminds me to a Japanese saying which says, when the student is ready, the teacher shows up. So I think you were ready on that, on your journey to meet those people. The other thing is that you're talking about how Timothy Leary pushed you not to seek the guru. And basically, I'm a big fan of Zen, and they're saying that, what was the saying? Well, I think Alan Watts says that if you think you need a guru and you need to go to Japan, then you need a guru and you need to go to Japan. But you don't have to. You can find it anywhere. And basically, it's up to you. So you don't really need a guru or to go to a particular place. Just like you don't need 20 years to reach enlightenment. You can actually get it in 5 seconds. It can take 20 years, but it can take 5 seconds, and it's up to you. And then lastly, you called me a philosopher, so I just want to be clear that I am at best a simple philosopher in the sort of a school of Socrates, rather than, let's say, an advanced philosopher like Kant, and his categorical imperative and all of that. I'm more of a simple philosopher who is interested, as you said, in asking good questions and in helping people apply philosophy in their daily life, which I think is the original spirit of philosophy, which is why I'm most attracted to ancient Greek and Roman philosophy like Stoicism, because I believe that kind of philosophy has immediate application today just as much as it had 2 or 3,000 years ago.
And you're always asking questions. I've also listened to a number of your podcasts now, and this was a story that Timothy Leary told me. Was there are these kids trying to find the meaning of life, so they go to India and they search for years, going into the mountains, and finally they find the guru who knows the meaning of life, and they ask the guru, what is the meaning of life? And the guru says, wet birds don't fly at night. and then they say, the kids say, they don't? And the guru says, do they?
That's brilliant. That's typical Zen. That's brilliant. Loving it. So let me ask you this though. You said you listened to a number of my podcasts.
Yes.
How come? And like which one is your favorite or your least favorite?
So, well, when I got invited to your podcast, I originally thought, reading the email that you sent me, that I was going to be invited as a guest into a sermon at the Church of Singularity. So I thought that I needed to at least know my enemy. So I decided I should listen and kind of get an understanding of what I was in for. But I was surprised, pleasantly surprised, and you were first of all very focused on ethics, which I think is important, and I'm very interested to find the things we disagree on, because it seems like there's more agreement than I imagined. And I can't remember his name now. It was an Indian doc guy who had
Amish Patel. That was the April Fool's joke.
Yeah, was it actually a joke, the whole thing?
It was an April Fool's.
Oh! It was very funny. I thought that was very funny. But in terms of the serious ones, I'm trying to remember. I listened to, well, really liked your manifesto, so that helped me get a sense of I think your thinking more than anything else on how you approached it. I also listened to one where you were talking to a nano physicist that worked in nanotech, and it was interesting because it actually triggered some. So we have a group at the Media Lab called Synthetic Neurobiology, where we're doing nano level visualization, but also perturbing neurons, and really trying to get to the simulation idea. And he was bringing up this idea of the randomness of quantum mechanics, and how the idea that the brain can be reduced into a mechanical simulation he thought was just impossible from a physics perspective. And there's an unpublished work, so it's been mentioned in conferences, but it's still not published. But we're starting to see some really interesting order and coordination in layers that we can't understand. And so there's this very interesting sort of stuff that, as you start to tease into some of these questions about simulations and chaos and randomness, and I heard that in a couple. So I skimmed a few of the podcasts and listened to a few all the way through. So, but those were some of the memorable moments.
Well, thank you very much. I really, really appreciate that. And I have to admit, as the name suggests, I did start like basically a Singularity fanboy, but that was 10 years ago. And in my journey, as I've been asking these questions and kind of trying to keep what, Zen Buddhists say called beginner's mind, I've kind of started to sort of distance myself, especially from the labels now, singularitarian and transhumanist. I really don't like those labels anymore.
And I think you actually took one of your interviewees to task as the same guy for using those interchangeably. Um, but can I the question I wanted to ask you is what is your definition of the sort of values of the singularity movement and the transhumanist movement? Because I use the word singularitarian in my paper, and I'm pointing to a particular belief system, but I wanted to make sure that we're talking about the same thing.
Right. Yeah. So I was going to get into that a little bit later about your views on the singularity, but that's okay. Let me answer your question now. So my take is a little bit different. So first of all, my definition of the singularity divides into two of the main sort of camps. One is the so-called the event horizon definition, where our ability to model and predict the future basically falls apart. So I think that currently where we're at right now, given the exponential technology and disruptive change that we're witnessing everywhere, our ability to predict how governance would look like in 20 or 30 years, how the family would look, how society would look, how our economic system, how religions would respond to this, how the law and politics and culture would respond to all of this, basically falls apart. Like, I don't believe we can predict what will happen in 30 or 40 years and how those things would pan out. Just like we could predict, for example, in the 1800s or let's say the 1200s, we could predict that the 1300s would not be too much different, perhaps. So that's one of the part of the definition, my definition of singularity. And the other part is basically the moment when machines become smarter than humans. Those are my definitions, basically. And as far as transhumanism goes, to me, and another reason why I don't like the term transhumanism is that I think it's the nature of humanity to transcend our biological limitations from the get-go. Basically, whether we have fire, whether we have clothes or not, whether we have glasses, everything is helping us transcend our limitations. And so I don't see there's a particular line in the sand beyond which you stop being human and you become transhuman per se, right? So in a way, being transhuman is kind of being human. That's what we've always done, right? Which is why I think I'd rather usually just call it human. But the idea of transhumanism is that basically science and technology help us overcome our biological limitations.
Can I poke two questions back?
Of course, of course.
So, because singularity often talks about the exponential growth as the primary driver of this, and it's also tends to be normative, that it's a good thing.
Right, right. Which is one of my problems with the singularity. My argument is that we don't know, that it could be a good thing, but it could be a bad.
Could be a bad. Okay. And I feel like the complexity is part of the reason you can't predict the future, not just because it's going up so fast. And it feels like
Absolutely.
that the sort of measurable exponential growth, which is tied to the people's addiction to wealth, I think makes singularity to me feel like the bubble that will never end and that will bring abundance. And to me, complexity doesn't necessarily bring abundance. And I think in one of the I think, for instance, in Peter Diamandis, who's he's a friend, but he, even on the website, it says the abundance that will finally feed all men, women, and children on earth. Well, we have enough food for all men and women and children on the earth. It's not distributed properly,
Absolutely.
and the distribution problem is a complex system problem, not an abundance problem. And so my
Exactly.
concern is, and for systems dynamics, I mean, exponential growth is things like cancer are exponential, and so exponential is usually a bad thing. It's only a good thing.
Absolutely.
Is dangerous. And so my concern with singularity and with the transhumanist movement, and this is kind of what I was, I think, trying to say in my essay that we might talk about, is that the church and the cult of singularity and transhumanism that is normatively pushing people to believe that we should achieve these at all costs, and that transcendence, whether it's in the singularity sense or in the transhuman sense, is sort of by definition a good thing, and that power is good, and both of these help us achieve power. That's the framework that I find somewhat troublesome.
And we are 100% in alignment with that, because the whole point of me starting my blog, coming from the Greco-Roman philosophical perspective, was to say that technology is not enough, that technology in itself is amoral, and I even wrote this short article called Technology is Not Enough, where I say exactly this. We have all the tools and the abundance to build, to give food to everyone, to build housing to everyone, to give them fresh water and so on, and yet we're not accomplishing that, right? So it's not a matter of abundance or technology only, right? Technology is not enough. There's a lot more other things that we need to figure out. And one of those, I say, is ethics, or ethics is probably the broader envelope which encompasses all of those other things. And that's where I saw my sort of calling, my fitting in the whole grander scheme of things, is to bring in that conversation, because when I started this 10 years ago, I thought it was lacking. And I believe, by the way, to this day, that it still lacks, especially in Silicon Valley, by the way, where people tend to be sort of techno-utopian and you know, people say I'm kind of very negative in that sense, and maybe they're right. But on the other hand, they have the positive bias where you see everything in black and white, sort of money or not money, growth or no growth, kind of simple measurements, which I don't believe GDP or decrease or increase, which I don't believe capture properly where we're headed, what our current situation is, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So I think it takes a lot more sophistication, and we got to go a lot deeper to get to the core. And I believe that the Socratic method of investigation can help us get there, by the way, which is why I've been doing what I'm doing, and I've been asking the questions that I've been asking now for 10 years. But let me go back on topic here, because we kind of digressed to me, whereas this conversation is about you. Because you see, I'm just the sort of the starting point, but I want to be the midwife to my audience giving birth to their own ideas. And so today is about you and your ideas and your work. It's not about me. So let me ask you this. What's your biggest dream?
My biggest dream. I think my dream is so I don't have traditional goal-like dreams, because I'm much more of I think a process-oriented person than I am a goal-oriented person. So I think my dream is that I am able to continue to feel like I'm flourishing and meeting interesting people and contributing to the system in an appropriate way. And I think it's tricky because the words here are very difficult, and it gets into the substance of our conversation, I think. But I think the idea of making the world a better place, it's for who at what time scale, you know. And some moments when I'm meditating and thinking about the universe, I think in very long time scales beyond human beings, and I think about what my ideas and what I will be in that context. And then when I'm with my, newborn 11-month-old child, I'm very in the moment thinking about her well-being. But I think, the I guess so my happiness is really to be able to think across scales and to feel like I'm having a thoughtful and an integrated relationship with everything around me.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And you said that you meditate. Do you do that often?
Yeah, I do it often, and I teach a class called Self-Awareness, or it's actually called Principles of Awareness, with Tenzin Priyadarshi, who is a Buddhist monk. And we start every class with 20 minutes of silence, and we require all the students to meditate and sleep 7 hours a day. Yesterday, we had somebody come in and teach Qigong. And so, especially during the semesters where I'm teaching it, which is a spring semester, I'm quite diligent about meditating every day. And then throughout the year, I meditate, but I'm not nearly as disciplined about it. But I meditate quite frequently. Yes.
Wow, you make me want to go back to school, to your school, to the MIT Media Lab anyway. Um, so why do you meditate? Are you religious in any way?
I'm not religious in any normal way. I think my family is Shinto, which is a polytheist, nature-oriented belief system, and uh, but I believe that there is a part of the world that's unknowable. And while I'm a big fan of the scientific method and falsifiable claims, I also think that the ability for us to tap into things that we can't yet explain is an important thing to cultivate. And I think you start with self-awareness. I think the contemplative side, both of any system, I think is important. And I think meditation is a great way to get that self-awareness. I also think intrinsic motivation is very important. And I think that being self-aware helps you both sort out all the motivations that you have and to develop a stable intrinsic motivation, which I think also helps stabilize both your. So, as a student of Buddhism, you must know this, but there's a great book called Destructive Emotions, where it's a Western psychologist talking to the Dalai Lama, and it's interesting because the Buddhists view destructive emotions like anxiety or fear very similarly to misunderstanding or cognitive failure as impairments to seeing the truth. And for me, meditation, whether we're dealing with emotions or thinking about ideas, it's all a way to try to get you closer to what might be true nature or the truth. And so I think meditation is a very good way to clear your mind and to become aware of biases, whether they're emotional or cognitive. And I think that helps you be much more centered, whether we're talking about philosophy or we're talking about our relationship to money.
Yeah, which is why I usually try to put a couple minutes of meditation before each of my interviews, by the way. But you mentioned the Western kind of fear in that book. Let me ask you this. So, do you have a biggest fear by any chance?
um I used to have more fears. I don't think I have a so I think we have first order, second order, third order wants and fears. So maybe you want Oreos right now. That may be a first order want, but you have another part of you that wants to not want Oreos right now, and then you have another part somewhere which is what you want. And so I think it depends on what level you are at the moment. So
Really zoomed out, like let's say some people fear, the communists are taking over, or we're becoming more communist as a system, or other fear that Trump is becoming unhinged, as one of the guests on my show said, or others fear nuclear war. Elon Musk fears artificial intelligence, just like, by the way, Nick Bostrom or Dr. Stephen Hawking. So in that sense.
yeah, well, so the problem is I when I zoom out, I zoom all the way out. And when I zoom all the way out, I'm not afraid of anything because I think humans aren't really that great for certain ecosystems. There really isn't anything that is fearful to me at the end of all things. And so, I might have certain things that I feel if I were to pick, would I want the end of humanity or not? Of course, as a human, I feel a duty to try to protect humanity, but would the end of humanity really be that awful from a cosmic perspective? I don't really know. Probably not. And this is where maybe the singularity folks and the transhumanists and I might differ, because I think I think what will happen, and it's neither good nor bad. And I think we have a role as individuals in a population in an evolutionary system to try to behave in a way that's consistent with our programming, and so it's natural to have certain fears, natural not to want to jump in front of a car, it's natural to want to save humanity, and it's natural to try to protect and support the communities that we are in. But I don't view them so much as fears, and I think of them more as I think I have a sensibility and a taste of how I would like my environment to be in, and I will nudge that environment in that direction, which tends to be ethical, inclusive, free of violence and excessive suffering. So those things. I mean, my values are quite clear.
Are your values therefore Shinto and or slash Buddhist in that way, in terms of their origin?
I think I have, yes, I think the Shinto idea that humans aren't particularly special, that we're all just part of nature, and this is a generally indigenous idea, which
Animist
is that
idea, very animist.
animist idea that nature doesn't belong to us, we belong to nature. So that's I think I believe, and then and 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 I am transhumanist in the way that you described it in your manifesto, which is I don't think that uh, our particular version of carbon-based neural intelligence should have special rights over any other kind of intelligence. I really like the way you framed that, and I would agree with that as well.
Thank you, that's fantastic. Let me see if I can shift the question a little bit more to the core of what you are and what you do. What are the biggest problems that humanity is facing today, in your view?
So I think the biggest problems that we have, if we were to look at the system of the planet and society, is that a lot of the positive feedback loops that we've created through our capitalist system and our focus on creating and deploying technologies for growth, convenience, and efficiency has created these exponential growths and markets that generally are going up. But what we've done is we've externalized costs, we've extracted from the environment, and we're creating complex systems that had in the past been able to be adaptive. So the temperature of the earth, the temperature of our body is usually in something like an equilibrium because our systems are self-adaptive. And I think by creating these exponential systems, we've started to knock them off balance. So, the life expectancy in the US is now decreasing. You see that the climate problem is not being solved. It's still continuing to be, headed in the wrong direction. And we have, I would say, social inequity is a problem that hasn't been solved. And this is not a new idea, but Donella Meadows and many of the systems dynamics people were very clear, even back in the 60s and 70s when they were working with the Club of Rome, that these tools that we've created, like entrepreneurship and investment, actually cause the poverty because you're really taking money and extracting it from the working class and depositing it in the passive capital class, and that growth by itself often exacerbates these problems. But the problem in society is that these tools that served us very well, I think if you look at post-war Japan or post-war Europe, it was pretty obvious that we had to build bridges and factories, and there was some fundamental infrastructural things that would lift people out of poverty that we did.
Including education and healthcare, by the way, which are free in both Japan and across Europe usually.
Absolutely. And I think our fight against infectious disease was tremendously successful. But now what we're seeing is that people are dying because of chronic diseases caused by obesity and bad food. And, and so all of the convenience that we built, all of the, driving around and, and the abundance of calories and all the things that helped us extend life actually are starting to hurt us. And so I think that the way that you intervene in a complex system like society or markets or climate, it's a very different approach than intervening in a orderly system, a predictable system. And so I think that we don't currently have the tools, but I think we don't currently have the paradigm. So I think one of the things when you think about it from an evolutionary dynamics perspective is that the paradigm, which is money and economics, and all of the individuals and the systems evolving towards maximizing returns, for instance, has driven us to work in this way. And
They've locked us in a kind of a global prisoner's dilemma where each of us is pursuing their optimum strategy, but that leads to a suboptimum equilibrium.
That's right. And what's interesting when you talk to people like Martin Novak from the Program of Evolutionary Dynamics is that he shows that actually cooperation is a fundamental feature in evolution, and that even human beings, when you don't give them this sort of mechanism for calculation, will default to a more cooperative, altruistic interaction, and that in fact the complexity that we generate in natural systems comes from cooperation, not from competition. So thinking about competition as the primary driver of education is actually wrong. So when they say Darwinian evolution, that's actually a very narrow piece of evolution. And what I think we've done is we've created a paradigm trying to increase the productivity of manufacturing that's focused more on competition and focused on a single metric of growth and a reduction of the payout function that's created an unhealthy evolutionary system. And I think the way you change that oversimplified reductionist view, which is the economics view, is that you have to change the values of society so that greed is good should sound stupid. More than enough should sound appropriate, and it should feel disgusting to do things that hurt the system. And I think there's a lot of actually academic work. This was fun doing the research for my thesis that really does show that when you turn things into financial transactions, it will diminish the will for people to do the work. It will extract a lot of the diversity and nuance from systems. And so I think this kind of neoliberal or this new short-term financial model, I think is sort of the key thing that we might need to change. And again, I think a lot of economists from Stiglitz to others have been poking at this. And again, I fight with the economists all the time because they always say, "Well, you're being unfair by focusing on GDP and all of and the utility function. We're way beyond that." And I say, "Well, you may be way beyond that, but whenever you guys are on a panel, all you talk about is GDP." So there's like the intellectual part, which is they have started to see the limits of their of economics, but when you get an economist on a policy discussion, they're still reducing it to dollars and cents.
So I will come back to this, but let me see if I can. I've got, you're one of those people. Usually I can keep my interviews easily for 2 or 3 hours, but you are one of those who I can keep probably for a week. And we'll still find new topics to talk about. But unfortunately, we only have about 80 minutes and we've used about 40 of them. So let me see if I can hit the main points I want to hit here in the following 40 minutes. So how does the MIT Media Lab fit within this context that you just painted for us with respect to those problems, or does it? Because many people may not be familiar with what the MIT Lab is.
Mm-hmm. So I think when the Media Lab was started 2 years ago, it was also interestingly around the same time that Wired Magazine and TED and all these and Alan Kay famously said you invent the future, you predict the future by inventing it. And it was a very optimistic time, when Apple Computer was overthrowing IBM, and we were moving from the stodgy institutions of Boston to the free Silicon Valley mode. And so I think we were, the Media Lab.
Apple had the Oliver Stone commercial where we break the Brick Brother thing.
And Apple delivered a box with a blinking cursor saying,
"Oh, no, sorry, it was a Ridley Scott commercial. I apologize." Yeah.
But the Apple computer was a blinking cursor saying "program me," right? Now Apple, you break your warranty if you jailbreak it, right? So those were an optimistic period where everybody just wanted to be generative and open, and so the over the last 30 years, I think we have started to realize that you can't just make stuff and that it will be good, and that even myself, I was quite optimistic about the internet really maybe just solving a lot of the world's problems by just giving everyone a voice. And little did we know that just giving everyone a voice wasn't enough, And so I think right now we're kind of in a mode where everyone in our industry, including the Media Lab, needs to be reflective, needs to realize that the complex problems that I was talking about are actually not about just inventing more efficient or more convenient stuff. And the Media Lab has always been about the relationships between humans and machines, whether it's interfaces or internet or social media or social physics. But I think what we're realizing is that that relationship now has to include a lot more of the philosophy, the social sciences, the humanities, to try to build up a framework of coevolution where we have a reasonable and sensible system so that we're not creating these out of control feedback systems. And we're also not creating an engineered platform that's independent of the social values. And so integrating these values. And I think at the individual level, all of these engineers had values and they had hopes that their technology would do what you want to do. I mean, it's a great. Seymour Papert was one of the early founding faculty of the Media Lab, and there are these old videos of him from the early days of personal computing, and he said someday every school would have a computer, and the computers will be computer languages will be used to unlock people's creativity like a new language. And the whole point was they were going to learn to code so that they could express themselves and be creative. But today all of our coding is about vocational stuff so that you can become another programmer at a big tech firm, and it's not about being creative and it's not about expression. And so I think a lot of these tools that we created at the Media Lab, assuming that they would just turn into these wonderfully creative, socially beneficial things, have become a part of this system. And so I'm not. I would say I don't think I speak on behalf of everyone at the Media Lab, but I do think that there is a substantial number of faculty and students who are in a much more reflective and critical view. We just had a 60 minutes segment done on us, which was great. But it's interesting because I got cut out of most of it because I was talking mostly about the concern that I have for technology, but they wanted to just talk about the future factory of the Media Lab. And so one of the things that's kind of interesting, I think, for me is that the Media Lab is often criticized for being techno-utopian. And we have a lot of faculty, and myself included, who are optimistic but critical. But the press doesn't pick up that side of the story. They want to pick up the old shiny utopian side, and so it reinforces this impression that the Media Lab is really about just the happy stuff.
Which is, by the way, one of the sort of niches that my show fits very well, is because I interview a lot of people like you, and one of the most common complaints that I get, and you just basically gave it, was that people go on TV or somewhere or in a documentary and they have a 1 or 2 hour interviews that ends up being edited into like 2 or 3 minute sound bites that end up being put in a way that they tell a story that has nothing to do with what the person was actually trying to say or arguing about, right? And which is why, for example, I don't ever try to cut in between during our interview. I cut in the beginning, I cut in the end. And basically, I want to give the authentic, the real, the 100% impression and view that people can put forward, right? I don't want to edit you out. And I think it's very important that we don't have edited conversations, because we lose 90% of the meat. And as you just said, in this case with 60 Minutes, great series, but they cut out the important stuff, it seems. Now, and let me focus a little bit on that here, even though time is advancing, that you see, one of the terms right now, because you're talking about that technology would not by itself be sufficient, even science would not by itself be sufficient, because one of the sort of the popular terms right now is STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And the idea is, if you get those 4 right, we're going to be fine. My argument is no, we're not going to be fine, because technology and even science and engineering are not enough. Even math is not enough. We need more. We need ethics. And you talk about bringing media, arts, and sciences. So we can bring STEM, but we also need media and arts at the Media Lab. So tell me about that. Why arts? Arts are the most useless thing you can do. I mean, think about it. Silicon Valley can't make money out of arts most of the time. You can't scale them. You can't. Uh, they don't fit in the economic paradigm we live in very well. And why even waste time therefore on them? They're not productive.
So I think the really interesting point is that, and this was an argument that we had with the even the art community when I was working on creating the arts category for Pre-Ars Electronica, which is a competition in Austria. And the role of the artist is to use tools or use a technology in unexpected and unusual ways that the designer or a normal person would never do, and also to try to help people reflect on technologies and things from different perspectives that would not normally happen. And I think one of the problems that we have when we are focused on productivity and on returns is you get stuck in these local optimums, and you get stuck in these patterns of belief or values. And what art is if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, that's the mutation. That's the person who says, I could actually turn this around and rotate it. What are you going to do about that? And people will say, why did you do that? They said, because. But now that you've turned it around, suddenly this thing that you thought was only this way, when you look at it sideways, you realize there's another dimension. And so artists, I think, just from a purely pragmatic perspective, they're the ones that help us advance by going into search spaces that you wouldn't go if you're purely pursuing efficiency or financial returns. And then the other thing that they do is that they bring a social context in. And so critical design and a lot of artists. So even I think it was Tony and Fiona Raby's lab at Royal Academy of Arts. They had a long time ago, even before we started talking about self-driving car ethics, they had an art piece about a self-driving car that I think was trained in one country not being allowed to be used in another country. And it was an artist from which I first heard that idea that you'd have different training contexts. And so artists, because they're free of having to actually prove exactly how you would do it, they might come up with ideas that would serve us well. And so I think arts is at a purely pragmatic way, that's one piece of it. And I think art also helps us take, and this gets a little bit into the design and aesthetics and philosophy, but you also can use art as a way to translate values out of a system. So if you're looking at an indigenous population that is very in tune with natural systems, it might be that you take the aesthetic system that they have and translate it into, let's say Muji or these minimalist movements. They often express themselves as an artistic form. But if a bunch of kids start saying, I love this minimalism, that may lead to a behavior that might be more sustainable than, loving gold-plated toilet seats. So that also is that the artistic aesthetic thing can have an impact. And then and I think the last thing I'll say is that if you have a new set of values like the hippie movement, and you want to push out the whole earth movement, often music, fashion, and arts is a good way to get a global movement to kind of synchronize around values than an argument or a formula or some kind of system, because I think an artistic system gets more directly into
Is a better medium for spreading ideas.
That's right.
Which is why humor and music are so powerful. Much more, I see that in my podcast. It's much harder to convince somebody to change their mind logically, as opposed to if you use music or humor, because then you can actually go through the fortress of their defenses. And you can actually communicate and reach places that you otherwise can't. So music and humor and art are much more powerful. And by the way, to continue what you're saying, this is where I think philosophy and my role comes into, because people say, well, you're not very optimistic necessarily about the future. You're supposed to be very optimistic. And my answer is usually, my job is not to be so optimistic. My job is to be like a gadfly. My job is, and this is where art, I think, fits too with what you're saying, is that artists and philosophers should provoke, should surprise, should push us in different directions. They should not just toe the line and support necessarily what you're just doing, because this is how you push the envelope, how you break the mold, and how you reach new places and have breakthroughs and paradigm shifts and all of that. So I absolutely love what you're saying. Now, we're running out of time, so let me quickly switch our focus here to your utterly phenomenal book, which is called Whiplash. And I love the design. It's so brilliantly designed with black and white highlights here, and every chapter starts in like this very cool way. I absolutely love the font and everything. It's very, very well designed. Speaking of design, this is a masterpiece, I think. So tell me, what's the thesis of your book, Whiplash?
So the thesis of my book is that the internet and computers and Moore's law has substantially lowered the cost of innovation and the cost of through the cost of collaboration and other things going down, and it's created a system that has pushed innovation to the edges, and has increased speed and complexity. So it's similar to the part of the singularity argument, and the book really goes through many different categories of fields, from biology to cryptocurrency to the development of hardware, and tries to give some principles for people who are trying to adapt to this new environment, principles that they can use as a way to think about how to survive or to flourish in this new environment. So it's kind of a matrix where I have 9 principles, and then I have narratives across different industries to try to illustrate those.
Mm-hmm. And I would recommend people check it out because I think it's excellent. But let me see if I can sum this up. I think what you're saying is basically that technology has outpaced, or that's the premise, I think, of the book anyway, that technology has outpaced our ability to understand it. And then you provide a framework consisting of those 9 principles which help us understand it, or have the best possible way, if not to control, to sort of nudge sort of direction towards the best possible outcomes that we can hope for, I think. So is that, first of all, a good way to put it?
I think that's, yes, I think that's appropriate. Yeah.
Okay, so when did this happen, and what are the costs to this happening, by the way, if that's the case then?
Yeah, so I think it's continuing to happen. It's a trend that started with, I think,
so that's in a way a singularity of the reason why I'm asking is because in a way this is the one of the definitions of a singularity that I was talking about, like beyond which our ability to understand it basically and therefore predict the future falls apart.
Yeah. So I do agree with you on.
That's the event horizon. We are, if what you say is true, we are now at that event horizon then.
Yes. I guess though the reason, so to me, when I hear singularity, I think more about this curve asymptote. So somehow the word to me is connected with the exponential.
Right. Forget the cause. That, like, this is the cause. I'm just saying you're claiming it's complexity that's bringing us there, and that's okay.
Yeah, and I think I would suggest that depending on the scale, there has always been an unknowability and a complexity and an unpredictability. So at the so I think you always have these sandwiches. At some ultimate layer, it's probably almost known, and at geological scales, it sort of is somewhat unpredictable. But then in shorter scales, it's like at an annual scale, it's pretty predictable. I would say that human civilization and society has become quite unpredictable, as you say, and continues to become so. But at other scales, it's probably hasn't changed a whole lot. But from the perspective of most of the people who would read the book, the world has changed, and this horizon where and I think that again, depending on the field and depending on the time scale, it's still predictable in certain ways. And I think my point, and one of my principles, which was one of my favorites. We dropped it from the book, and we actually might put it in the next one. Is learning over education, which is
Right.
that learning is what you do for yourself, and education is what other people do to you. And I think one of the things is that since the world is continuing to change, you have to continue to learn. And so I think that the idea that so I guess I look at it less as kind of a event horizon or some sort of dot of singularity, and think of it more as a ever increasing complexity that challenges us to be more humble about what we think we can control.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So the last principle that you talk about, number 9, is systems over objects. And we touched a little bit on that when you talked about capitalism, right? So talk to me just a little bit more, because this is the core of my criticism to institutions such as Singularity University in particular, or Silicon Valley in general, even that, they claim to be new and this and that, but basically they're just perpetuating and recreating arguably the best parts of the old system. And so in a way they're recreating it rather than changing it or even evolving it. And therefore, they're not necessarily the future, or they're not open-ended towards the future, because they just want to copy and paste the present of the current system, and how that system then has certain particular kind of systemic failures, systemic structures that leads to certain particular systemic outcomes that cannot be changed unless you actually change the system. This basically has been the gist of one of my arguments against them.
Yeah, that's right. I think that I think there are a lot of people in Silicon Valley who are systems thinkers in to the extent that it's a part of the strategy, but they are all individuals in a system and objects in a system rather than being part of the system. And being part of the system is interesting because it's a very humble participant, like a citizen in a government or individual in an ecosystem. So, we often say you're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic. and the idea is that I think a lot of these companies think about themselves versus the system, and their self is this kind of object oriented thing, and as an
They think they're unique, which is why they call themselves unicorns.
that's a good point. Yeah,
Right? They see themselves as totally outside of the system. I'm different. I'm a unicorn, for God's sake. How could you compare me to this?
that's right. That's right. And that's and even as a community, they're somewhat untethered from the local government and untethered from the rest of the world. And so I don't think they like to think about themselves as a humble participant in a system. And this causes this kind of, and when they're successful, though, the companies that are successful and become unicorns, they become, I don't think they like to be called cancers, but sort of from a systems perspective, it's almost cancerous in that they become either monopolistic or they become so big that they actually take the nutrients out of the system from others. Now, compared to Wall Street and the other financial systems, it is a generally growing system. So I think the argument that Silicon Valley will say is that we're not zero sum, the pie is increasing, but it's hard to say because it's not zero sum depending on how you measure it. But there are certain things that are zero. I mean, there's limits to growth, and there's there's only so much physical stuff.
I wrote this article some time ago called "Why Technology is the Future of Politics and Politics is the Future of Technology," and I argued that the view perpetuated by Silicon Valley in general and Singularity University in particular is that we need more money, capital, technology, and everything will be fine. But the golden state is the poorest state in the United States, by the way, when you take into consideration cost of living. And if you go to other places, and so Silicon Valley has the highest conglomeration of capital and technology in the world, and yet when you go downtown San Francisco or Los Angeles or some other places, me and my wife were driving through California, as Canadians, we were kind of shocked by the levels of poverty that was on display everywhere. I mean, mass shocking poverty everywhere that you couldn't escape, downtown Los Angeles or San Francisco. And as a Canadian, that kind of shocks me. And so if you come to Canada, we have less capital and less technology, but you don't have that much poverty on display. You go to Scandinavia, even less capital and less technology, and yet a lot less. So therefore, it's very obvious, at least to me, that it's not the solution is not technology and capital. The solution is something else that lacks there. And it's at the system level, and therefore, if you're looking at system, it's kind of a cultural slash political slash social slash ideological or philosophical level, if you will.
No, I totally agree, and I think I think the other risk is even when they look at the system. I mean, I think it's just if you've been successful. First of all, when you become a billionaire, everybody treats you like you're smart, and it's very difficult to become self-aware enough to know how and to become humble, even though you built a company and become a billionaire. And so
I think billionaires need to do what the Roman emperors used to do, which is have somebody who would tell them all the time, and you're mortal too. But the thing is now billionaires tell themselves, oh, I'm not going to be mortal because I'm going to defeat aging. So they think they're gods in some ways. And that self-perpetuating prophecy that, oh, I made money, therefore I'm very smart. And if I'm smart in making money, I'm therefore smart in politics. I'm smart in social culture, and I can tell people what to do in all those other fields that have nothing to do with money.
Yeah. And there's a lot of, first of all, there's a number of them, so they're enough to be a culture. And then you have storytellers like Ayn Rand and others who have kind of created a framework for thinking about themselves as
self-congratulatory framework.
And some of them are quite smart, but I think the problem is that even if you're super smart, even if they were, let's say, geniuses, I think that you can't, from a perch on top, actually understand the complexity of the world and actually intervene in a appropriate way.
Many of them are geniuses, but and let me just be totally undiplomatic here and tell you one of the lessons I've learned after interviewing 230 of the smartest people around the world, and that's probably not a good thing, but I've learned that genius and stupidity are roommates, and they reside under the same roof. Because you can have people who are brilliant geniuses in one field, and yet in the same time they go into another field and they totally have no clue what they're talking about. And yet because they're so good in that one field, they believe they're entitled to be right in the other field too.
No, and that's common. And I think you mentioned Caesars, but I was remembering there was an essay that I read a long time ago. I can't remember who wrote it, but it was talking about what's called the Caesar complex. So if you become a Caesar, it takes every part of you and amplifies it, so that if you're narrow, you burn down the whole city, And so I think there is also this other thing that happens once people stop telling you you're wrong, and it does start to warp values as well. And I think there's a similar risk of that.
Yeah, and I to be honest, one of the things that got me concerned when I was for 10 weeks at Singularity University in Silicon Valley was that there's this reverence for those people who have achieved $1 billion net worth or more. There's a reverence for them. And we fail to see them as human beings quite often because you see they have $1 billion or something. And my impression was that they do stupid stuff all the time. Some of it very, very stupid, actually, and dangerous, actually. But we're really running out of time. So let me ask you here. We have about 12 minutes. Let me ask you here. What's the biggest lesson from your book, Whiplash, so that then we can switch and talk about your thesis?
Yeah, I think the biggest lesson from my book is I think the biggest lesson from my book is probably the principle that I have is that I like is compasses over maps, or it's similar to the things around emergence, but it's this idea that you should have a compass heading, a trajectory, Once that's strong, and that could be values or it could be a process, you need to be very agile. And then there's a principle, pull over push, but pulling things from the network as you need them. And I think focusing less on planning and more on values, ethics, and a sensibility actually is a fairly decent way to survive in a system where, as you said, predictability is no longer an easy thing to achieve.
And when you were talking about local optimization, it reminded me actually that we are kind of in this planetary prisoner's dilemma where all those companies and billionaires are optimizing locally very efficiently and effectively at the local scale. So they reach maximum efficiency, but that leads to a global disequilibrium or suboptimum outcome at the global scale, hence the global prisoner's dilemma. And the only way is, just like in the prisoner's dilemma, the two prisoners must stop to compete against each other and start instead to cooperate. The same thing to me seems right now at the planetary level that we must get to. Now, okay, so let's talk about your upcoming PhD thesis that I had a little preview at here, called The Practice of Change. Fantastic work. I think in some ways it's pushing the envelope way beyond Whiplash, actually. And the main question that you start with is, quote, how can we understand and effectively intervene in interconnected, complex, self-adapted systems, end of quote, which is what we were talking about. So tell us, how can we do that?
I mean, I think it connects a lot to what we've talked about, which is, and I draw on the work of Donella Meadows, who talked a lot about how you intervene in complex systems, and and I'll use an illustration that I use in the paper about Monopoly. So everyone knows the game Monopoly. It turns out in 1903 or so, it was actually invented. It was based on a game called Landlord's Game, which was by the Georgists, who were basically the precursors to communists. And they were talking about how rents and property ownership would drive people to tenants that were impoverished. And it was a game to try to teach kids the perils of capitalism.
Winner takes it all kind of outcomes.
But the game was to show how that was bad, and teach kids away from capitalism. But Parker Brothers just changed the goal from teaching people about the perils of capitalism to, you are now the capitalist and you win when you drive your friends to bankruptcy. And what's interesting is that the rules primarily stayed the same. They just changed the goal. And when you look at a system, let's say the economy or climate, we're doing a lot of work trying to come up with new rules and regulations, and trying to figure out technologies to try to create, let's say, enlightened self-interest, to try to get people to harm the environment less, or harm poor people less. But if the goal is still to try to make as much money as you can, because the old sayings, I'd rather be rich than stupid. It's like, that's the goal, right? So the problem is, if that's the goal, you can throw all these rules in, but often the system will evolve around these rules, and you will continue to be using all of the tools at your disposal to become the biggest, most powerful company or the richest, most powerful person. And again, we have great rules like antitrust and other things that we should be using to tackle the perils of things like monopolies. But ultimately, if we could change the goals, I think, and get people so that their primary goal in life wasn't to make a lot of money and to eliminate and drive to bankruptcy their friends, but in fact to collaborate and to create systems that are measured more about happiness and flourishing, I think the behavior of these companies would change. Now, it might not need me to do that, because you now start to see kids are not wanting to go to companies that have the wrong values. You see people boycotting products that aren't good. You see the Parkland kids finally coming up, protesting guns in a way that politicians were never able to do. You see the Time's Up movement, and so there are these movements coming that are going through this cultural, somewhat emotional layer to change the behavior of people. And if you can change the behavior of everyone in the system, then I think that changes. So Donella Meadows' point was the power to transcend paradigms. And one paradigm is the paradigm of economic measurement, which drives an evolutionary dynamics towards the focusing on financial returns as a primary measure, which pushes towards competition, extraction, and exploitation. But if the values, if you transcend that and say, you know what, I'm not just going to measure everything in money, I'm going to measure it in things like the richness of experience, the how naturally robust something feels like, and also just measuring things in size. So having a family twice as large doesn't make you happier. Having so I think there are a lot of things that we already know don't actually make you happier if you have more of. And then there are other things also, which is translating everything to money. So the economists would have us believe that through a utility function, everything can be calculated as money. But it turns out that in organizations, if you start to reward people financially, sometimes that creates a transactional feeling for those behaviors, and people who might otherwise do them stop doing them. Or the one that Larry Lessig likes to use is sex. If you pay for sex, it doesn't feel as good as if you get it from an amateur for free, right? So there are many things that when you convert into a transaction reduces the value. And so it's not that those things aren't existing already in society, but the value of money has really taken off to a destructive level. And so it's about rebalancing this. And I think the point that I'm trying to explore in my thesis is both the way in which you do those interventions, focusing on social inequity, climate, and health, and how we might redesign everything from higher education to the way we think about managing communities, to try to tackle, I think, the biggest problems today, which are all these wicked, complex problems.
Mm-hmm. And let me just do a couple of short quotes here. So in the beginning, you say that your goal is to, quote, ask questions that drive us to the conversations about first principles and how we should design and intervene. End of quote. Very Socratic approach, by the way, to ask questions and to start a conversation. And then one of the starting claims you make is, quote, I argue that markets do not provide the appropriate mechanism for addressing the complex societal problems that face us. You see, that's very different from what Silicon Valley says. Silicon Valley says just more capital and more technology and we solve all of our problems. That's basically, which is why we need more venture capital, more startups. And if everyone's a startup, we'll not have any problems in our planet. Basically the argument. And you say, systems dynamics provides a way to understand and intervene in a complex system design as way to describe intervention from within complex systems. So that's where I think you're really kind of like pushing the envelope further. But we are running out of time. We probably only have like 3 or 4 minutes here left. So, and of course, as you said, I used to be a Singularity fanboy. So I started out calling everything the Singularity, Singularity FM, Singularity Info. Let me read perhaps a very long quote from your thesis here, which talks about your position on the Singularity, because I think it may be the most time efficient way to share your view with our audience, which is, it goes like this, quote, the new species of Silicon Valley mega companies which engage in the machines of bits are developed and run in great part by people who believe in a new religion, Singularity. The new religion is not a fundamental change in the paradigm, which is exactly my point, but rather the natural evolution of the worship of exponential growth applied to modern computation and science. The asymptote of the exponential growth of computational power is artificial intelligence. The notion of singularity, that AI with its exponential growth would supersede humans and that everything we have done until now is insignificant, is a religion created by people who have experience of using computation to solve problems hitherto considered impossibly complex for machines. They have found a perfect partner in digital computation, a knowable, controllable system of thinking and creating with rapidly increasing ability to harness and process complexity and bestowing wealth and power on those who have mastered it. In Silicon Valley, the combination of groupthink and the financial success of this cult of technology has created a positive feedback system that has almost no capacity for regulating itself because it receives scant negative feedback, while many holding these beliefs would resist having them compared to a religion, instead arguing that their ideas are science and evidence-based. Those who embrace singularity engaged in quite a bit of arm-waving and make leaps of faith based more on trajectories that ground truths to explain their ultimate visions. And then you go on to say that, but if modern corporations are a precursor to our transcendence, the singularitarian view that with more computing and biohacking we will somehow solve all the world's problems, or that the singularity will solve us, seems hopelessly naive.
Mm-hmm. Who said that? That sounds great.
How do you unpack this for us in a minute or two?
Well, I would love to hear if you disagree and what your criticism would be.
Well, to be honest with you, I don't. I love it. It's kind of what I've been about for 10 years now, which is the modus operandi, the core of my argument. Technology is not enough. Capitalism is not enough. Silicon Valley is not enough. In fact, I've gotten so extreme, maybe, that now I'm concerned that Silicon Valley may not save the world, but may actually end up destroying it. I mean, look at Facebook, Cambridge Analytica. The other day, I was interviewing a great, brilliant young mathematician who started two companies who are a lot more capable than Cambridge Analytica. And they're called Quid and Primer, both huge defense contractors. So I agree with everything that you say. I can't,
Okay.
I can't argue with it.
Because when I got your email, I thought you were going to pick it apart. I would finish by actually saying that I think you have a tremendously important role. I think the people who are taking your path, starting as fanboys and going into the science and starting to think about systems. I started out also, I was mentioned at the beginning of the interview, my first dream was to upload my brain, and that's where it started, and I think that anyone who's excited about the future of humanity and science gets this very optimistic view, especially if you read science fiction and things like that. But then the reality of the world hits you. And I think this moment when the reality of the world hits you, and this is where meditation and other things are important. First, you have to have the moral stamina to not be freaked out and still be happy and optimistic. But you also then embark on a mission to try to subvert this, growth-oriented trajectory. And I think that your role, as well as my role as part of a science and technology institution, is to try to bring a sensibility of, and regulation has this kind of legal word, but it also has a much better biological systems word. So, when you upregulate and downregulate your hormones, it's to try to make you happy, and it's try to make you appropriate. And when you are unable to regulate yourself, you get fevers and you get cancer. And so regulation is not a bad thing. And I think that you want systems that self-regulate. Otherwise, they basically go into some sort of extinction-like path. And so I think, so anyways, I think that if we can figure out an appropriate way to communicate with people the risks of exponential thinking and the way to regulate in a way that doesn't take away the flourishing, but that tries to make the system. And again, I think self-adaptive systems are also another important thing. So in the environment and the ecosystem in our body, there's no one in charge. The system adapts itself because it's robust. There's no messiah, there's no central planner, there's no unicorn that's figuring it all out. And that's a Soviet idea. And I think the idea that some central planner somewhere in Silicon Valley can control everything is actually we've kind of, especially in a complex system, isn't going to work.
So you called Silicon Valley the Soviets. I love it. Loving it. That's a Soviet idea. Okay, we're behind schedule. So, but let me ask you two quick questions.
Yeah.
Where can people find more about Joi Ito?
Okay, so that's easy. There's joi.ito.com, which is my website that has links to just about everything. I occasionally try to do videos and podcasts like you, so I'd love for people to look at those and, as you say, write reviews and things like that. But I'm publishing more in other ways to try to get to other channels. But my website has a link to everything, so that'd be great.
I watched some of your episodes, and my favorite is the one with Seth Godin, by the way.
Okay, it's fun.
Who is amazing, even though you have many other great ones. And lastly, what do you want for our parting message to be today? After 85, 90 minutes with Joi Ito today, what's the most important thing that our audience should take away from you today?
I think it's to have a critical view of science, technology, and everything without losing hope and optimism. And that balance, I think, is essential for whether you're a technologist or you're a lawmaker or anyone else.
Joi Ito, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
If you guys enjoy this show, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. You can go and write a review on iTunes, or you can simply make a donation.